It is now my pleasure to introduce our discussant for the next panel, Beth Kaiser. Beth is the Associate Director in the Division of Research and Statistics at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Her research is focused on banking competition, consumer choice in banking and payments, and banking supervision. We also have a special affinity for Beth because we work with what's called the Cassidy application, the competitive factor analysis application that, in fact, the bankers in the room may have used in the past. And Beth has been an especially great partner on that, so thank you for that. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and German from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her Master's and PhD in Economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Beth?
Okay, can you all hear me? Let's see, great. So first, thanks so much to the organizers of this conference that allows us to come together in this community. It's a really, as others have said already, it's a really special forum. And as an economist, and I think as, I hope I can speak for all the economists here, we're all lifelong learners, and the best thing I think any of us can be doing here is learning from your incredibly strong knowledge, skills, experience, so that we can better understand the world around us, and so that the research that we are doing is based on something that's real. So thank you. So let me introduce today, we have a fantastic set of participants here, both our community bank discussant and for really interesting research topics. So let me introduce everybody. So first, Mike Milshanowski of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. On his home turf, and hopefully sharing some really interesting knowledge today. Bob DeYoung of the University of Kansas, a longtime colleague of mine. Happy to see you here again. And Louis Wynn of the University of St. Andrews. I believe that's a new role for you, so congratulations on your move there. And finally, Zifeng Feng of Florida International University, FIU. And Tom, it's been great getting to know you here at the conference. I loved seeing the profile of you in the video as well. So I'm really interested to hear your perspective as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Mike, please take it away.
Thank you. So first I just want to say it's an honor to be here today. Over the last 5 years since the inception of the conference, I've served on the planning committee of the conference. And it's been great to see the growth of the conference and the evolution it's taken and the impact it's made on community banking broadly, I will say. So our paper is titled CEO Secession and Performance at Rural Banks. And this is joint work with Drew Dahl here at the St. Louis Fed and our colleague Dan Koster at Utah State University. I'll also add the disclaimer that these views are our own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the Federal Reserve System, or Utah State University. I want to start a little bit with about the motivation for why we chose this topic, and it is directly linked to this conference and others. So the focus on management succession and community banking has been prominent at conferences like this over the last several years, including this conference. There was a case study competition last year, as there were the last 4 years, and this topic was succession planning was the topic of the case study competition last year. Additionally, the FDIC's 2017 Community Bank Conference had a large session on succession planning. So this is top of mind of academics in the community banking research space. This year, the 2018 National Survey of Community Banks included new questions on succession planning that came out of the discussion at last year's session. And we've heard lots of anecdotes from that work, and I wanted to share a couple of those today that may set the scene for what we're looking at. So we hear that rural banks are having a more difficult time than urban banks in finding successors for key roles, key management roles. A couple of those anecdotes I'll quote. It's more difficult to entice qualified individuals to move to rural areas with depressed economies, substandard school systems, and limitations on city services, was from one banker. Another banker said, our best high school graduates are going off to college, but they're not coming back. So lots of evidence out there coalescing around this common idea that it's more difficult for rural banks to find succession than in urban banks. Governor Quarles this morning did us a good did our paper a great benefit in outlining all of the differences between rural and urban banks, and really showing performance-wise that rural banks are doing quite well relative to their urban community bank counterparts. So our paper is going to look very narrowly at what happens after a CEO secession, and how does that impact, we're going to look at the management rating there. Troy Kravitz's paper in the last session also dealt with this issue, the difference between rural and community banks. So I also wanted to mention, Janet Griffiths, I'm going to paraphrase you from yesterday. You said, we need to marry the data and research with anecdotal information. I think what we're trying to attempt here is to validate these commonly held beliefs with a new set of data and a new set of research to see if those beliefs hold. So let me start with just sharing the key findings up front, so as we go through the research methodology, you understand what we've done. So what we found is that CEO replacements at rural banks relative to urban banks did not necessarily require compromises that are evident in subsequent management performance as assessed by the regulators. And so these results are inconsistent with the notion that rural banks are threatened by a talent migration, if you will, away from rural communities to urban communities, and are therefore unable to replace CEOs with the same effectiveness as urban banks. Again, this contrasts quite considerably with the anecdotal evidence of the difficulties encountered by rural banks in management succession. Okay. So methodology, what do we do? I already mentioned we're investigating the difference in performance between urban and rural banks after a CEO change. And we're going to assume that that managerial talent influences performance here. Of course, there are many other factors that influence the performance of the bank: the market the bank's in, the economies of that market, the quality of the bank's board of directors, the quality of the lenders in the institution, and many other factors. But here we're focusing very narrowly on the management performance at the institution after the CEO change. So one of the key empirical advantages we have is access to confidential supervisory data, and we're going to look at the management rating of CAMELS as our trigger for if that bank improves in the quality of the management after the CEO change or declines as a measure of performance in this paper. As you know, CAMELS ratings are established in on-site bank examinations, and it's the examinations team overall assessment of an institution's management team when they go. And these are conducted periodically along with the supervisory examinations. So the management rating component is unique in this research. Also, it's a sample, which we constructed a sample of CEO successions from SNL data. This is now S&P Global Financial. But SNL for years has provided the key leadership at each institution in their data set. We went back through that data historically and were able to identify the date at which CEO successions occurred at community banks. So here in our sample, we're looking at banks less than $10 billion to align with the Dodd-Frank definition. And we're looking at banks, the CEO successions that occurred between 2003 and 2016. We've identified just over 1,500 observations. And roughly 12,000 of those occurred in urban areas. And we did see that the uptick in mergers and acquisitions in urban areas over rural areas in that time period. And 300 or so are located in rural areas. It's important to define how we differentiate between urban and rural here. For urban banks, we're saying these are banks that are located in metropolitan areas. And for rural banks, we're saying outside of metropolitan and metropolitan. That takes away sort of, we think, this banks that might be headquartered in a suburb, right, where some of their market may be in a rural area, some of their market or activities might be more. So it creates a little bit more differentiation there for us. Also want to note that our sample necessarily excludes community banks that decided for some reason or another to go ahead and merge or sell their institution rather than face secession challenges they were facing. So that may be a choice they can make. What I'll say there is that we believe that the same choice faces both urban banks and rural banks, and it's not just a rural bank decision that they're making. And then in this year's survey on community banks, which we're going to hear about after lunch, there is a question that asks bankers. It says, how important is secession issues in your decision to seriously consider an acquisition? 45% of bankers said it is very important or important. We looked a little deeper at that data, the home field advantage, right? And we found that that difference is the same at rural banks and urban banks. So we think both pools in our sample are facing this issue and working on this issue. Finally, we included bank-specific and publicly available call report data for performance factors in our work. So what we're doing is we're testing whether urban banks do indeed have a performance advantage after a CEO change. And we test two hypotheses. The first, do banks experiencing secession in urban areas exhibit a shorter time to upgrade in the management rating compared to those in rural areas after the secession takes place? And the second is the flip side of the coin. Do banks experiencing CEO secession in urban areas experience a longer time to downgrade in management rating than rural banks? And if those are true, that would suggest that the anecdotal evidence that rural banks are having more difficulty than urban banks in finding secession talent would be true. So I'm not going to show regression results, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the specification in the model and try to sort of, I guess I'll say I'm not the econometrician on the team of co-authors. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about sort of maybe a layman's view of how the model works so you can explain why we chose the model and the methodology. So we use an accelerated failure time model. This is a common model in survival analysis, and it's used in epidemiology, which is the study of the progression of diseases. And so if you think about a human as being an organism, right, and you insert a disease, whether that's a cancer or a bacteria or a virus, there's some amount of time until you get to a failure event, which could be death or it could be recovery from the disease. And we're measuring the distance between that change and the event that occurs, right? So in our case, the bank is the organism, or is the entity. We're inserting a new CEO, which is a change to the organization, and we're seeing how long it takes for the management rating to change, either upgrade or downgrade. The factors that we're looking at, and we're determining whether they're statistically significant or not, are those factors that either accelerate that path from the change to the point of failure or improvement, right? Or in this case, the change in the management rating, or decelerate that. And we look at a lot of things. We look at asset size. We look at the starting management rating, whether that, we have a variable for whether that was a poorly rated in management, a 3, 4, or 5. And so the key variable, though, that we're looking at is whether that bank was in a rural market or not. And that'll tell us, if that's significant, whether the urban bank has an advantage in the CEO change in this narrow context. So the results, and I teed this up earlier, but we actually reject both hypotheses. And what that means is that urban banks are not slower to experience downgrades or quicker to experience upgrades than their rural bank counterparts in this narrow regulatory assessed management rating context. So this, I think, is consistent with the performance metrics that we heard earlier today, but it's a new sort of look at how this happens after a CEO change. We tested this in a couple different ways for robustness, including stratifying our samples to make sure that it held across a variety of different stratifications. We did this by management rating, and we also did this by examination interval. And I should note, too, that we know when the exam rating occurred before the CEO change, so that's a variable in our regression, and we know how long it took afterwards to control for when the management rating. So basically, how much of an impact or how long did the CEO have to make an impact? So to conclude, our results collectively are inconsistent with the notion that rural banks are unable to replace CEOs with the same effectiveness as urban banks. And the findings suggest that problems rural banks encounter in the future will not necessarily be aggravated by secession difficulties. So I'll stop there. Thank you.